Hello, everyone. Sientir here, and welcome to my Patron Podcast for September 2021. The winning topic was, what are my thoughts on The Legend of Korra? So before I begin, just as a little reminder, you can help select the topic for next month's Patron Podcast or any future Patron Podcasts by going to my Patreon at patreon.com/Sientir and signing up. So, The Legend of Korra. I'm going to quickly, couple of highlights. The Legend of Korra is a sequel to Avatar: The Last Airbender. It has four seasons rather, that they call books. Series is a British term for a season for some reason, and I don't know why that was in my head. Anyway, so there are four books, and each one is kind of like its own arc of like a narrative that kind of like concludes at the end. Overall, I liked the series, and I thought it got stronger as it went on. I felt that it started a little bit weak, not like super weak, but a little bit weaker compared to where it ended up. Now, before I go any further, I do want to say I have a lot of thoughts I want to share, but there will be spoilers on The Legend of Korra, as you might expect. Also, there will probably be some spoilers on Avatar: The Last Airbender, as it's inevitable that I'll want to make comparisons between the two. I don't script these in advance, so I'm just anticipating it. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump in, just talking some about the different books. I felt like book one, it did a really good job of trying to maintain continuity with the previous stuff, specifically with Avatar and carrying forward characters and whatnot, while also advancing the world. This is something that I quite like seeing happen, where worlds do develop technologically, and they do that here, and I quite appreciate that. As well as sort of the advancements made over the course of the show itself. And I also like how they made sure that they weren't ignoring stuff that had come previously, and they were indeed indicating, hey, this is part of the same continuity. These characters some of them are still around, but, they're maybe getting a little up there in age. But, their influence and impact on the world has been felt. With, like, for example, the statue of Aang in Republic City. And I, in particular, really like the brief opening that Tenzin narrates, where we have the statue of Aang and pivoting over to Korra. I think that's a really good way of kind of drawing the connection between the two. Overall, I think the pro-bending stuff is really interesting as well. It's not necessarily like my favorite part of it. A little confused about the rules too, to be honest. But there's a lot of focus on it. I think Amon is a really interesting villain, though, and what he's doing with that. I think he's bringing up some legitimate points about the concern of, like, what about people who don't have bending? Are they being given equal rights and all of that? I think that's a very valid concern that he is exploiting. I will say also was really interesting to me as I was watching it and watching what Amon was doing, as well as Tarlok, I think, was the name of Amon, but proved to be Amon's brother, the council member that was very antagonistic to Tenzin. I genuinely, like, partway through, suspected Tarlok of being Amon in secret, because it felt like what was happening was he was able to make a power grab through what was going on with the Equalists. It almost felt like he was trying to pull a Palpatine to me, to use a bit of a Star Wars prequel trilogy reference, where he is trying to create a situation to exploit to gain power. Obviously, that proved not to be the case, but it certainly was interesting to kind of speculate about some of that stuff. And I think one of the other things that I really like that they did with book one is they really set up Korra as distinctly different from Aang. It would have been really easy to be tempted to make another character that was very much like Aang, but Korra is very much not. They're not completely polar opposites, but there's a lot of difference. Aang was very reluctant to be the Avatar. Korra was 1,000% on board with being the Avatar. Aang was very spiritual, and Korra is very physically oriented, and really struggled with the spiritual part. And overall, it felt like a really strong payoff with the season of she's struggling with airbending. Finally, that's the one thing she can reach for, and she grabs it, and that leads to her sort of unlocking this thing that she's been struggling with connecting with her spiritual side, and having the payoff of Aang showing up there was really strong, and I really liked that, as well as the way that they tied everything in. The stuff that happened in between. That said, a lot of the pro-bending stuff, I was like, there's a lot of this, and I I'm just not that interested in the teenage romance stuff that they had going on with Mako and Bolin and Korra and Asami and all of the every confusion that was happening there. I think there's probably some realistic portrayal to it if I had to guess, but I never really had any sort of romances in my teenage years, and even up to this point. And frankly, the whole idea of falling in love, like, do I want a spouse? Absolutely, but the idea of falling in love doesn't really appeal to me. So seeing stories that have a heavy influence on that may be a bit weaker for me, just because that's not something I personally connect with as much. And it took up a lot of screen real estate that I would have liked to have seen potentially spent on other stuff. But you know, season 2, I thought a lot of the or book 2 or whatever you want to call it, the internal conflict was really interesting. I'm going to be curious, as a complete aside. At the moment I'm recording this, I had the nightlight on Windows on, and it just ended just now, and I'm curious if that'll have changed the brightness of my screen on my face. But that's completely beside the point. Enjoy this peek behind the curtain. So I thought a lot of what was going on there with the spiritual side was interesting, as well as sort of the dynamics and conflict. And I liked the way that Book 3 elaborated on why Korra's father and Tenzin were so protective of her with everything that had gone on with the Red Lotus. I thought that was a really good way of sort of backfilling stuff that Book 2 kind of felt a little bit weaker on. I thought the origin of the Avatar stuff that they did in the middle was also really interesting. However, and I'm probably not alone on this, I did not like what they did with basically getting rid of the previous incarnations in Rava in the Avatar spirit. I just did not like that at all. One of the things that I thought was really cool about the Avatar concept within the mythos, I guess, the Avatar verse or whatever they're calling it, is the Avatar's ability to connect to the other elements is neat, but the ability to go back and connect with past lives I thought was really, really cool, and sort of that explanation for why the Avatar uniquely has this I thought was really interesting. Getting rid of that feels like a major loss, and it also feels like it undermines some of the payoff from the previous season. Like, one of the big payoffs from Book 1 was that she was now able to connect with her past lives. She was able to connect with her spiritual self. And to get rid of that at the end of Book 2, I thought, like, it undermines some of the reward that you're getting from Book 1, and I really, really dislike that. I get the impression from some of what they said that, yeah, that definitely did not necessarily land super well with everyone. I would be curious to know why they made that decision, though I'll admit I have not looked to try to find their explanation. So I might poke around a little bit after this to see if that is out there. Then I liked what they did with Zahir in Book 3, and bringing back the Wind Nation. I thought was a really interesting way of doing it. In particular, I like the way that they kind of built things with Book 3 and Book 4 together, and the trauma that Korra went through, that they didn't just erase it with Book 4. I really appreciate that they spent the time to kind of like digest it and work through it. I liked that a lot of the romance stuff was also kind of not as present, taking up a bunch of screen real estate and a bunch of runtime. It's one of those things where you had a little bit in Avatar: The Last Airbender, you had a little bit of some romance stuff. You had some tension between Aang and Katara, and like Katara and Jet and stuff. And you had, of course, the stuff with Zuko and Mai and all that. But it wasn't like a huge part of it. It was kind of like little moments here and there. And also the pacing on Avatar: The Last Airbender was just very different. It had a little bit more room to breathe in that show. So taking up the time on some of the romance stuff in Korra made it kind of like a higher proportion of the show, it felt like. And again, that's something I'm just not as personally interested in. So my preference would have been for a bit less, and we got less in Books 3 and 4, which I appreciated. I also really liked. I felt like Book 3 was stronger than the previous two, and I felt Book 4 really brought things together in a really strong way. And I really liked the fact that Zahira was still alive and she could go back and talk with him, and what was going on there with the idea of balance of like all of your previous villains had a point in terms of like some of the stuff that they're doing. Like, there does need to be protections for non-benders. They do need to make sure they have a safe place in the world because they are unpowered, basically. you do want to make sure that things are balanced with the spirits, and perhaps opening the spirit portals was the right decision, and maybe Avatar 1, I think that was the first one, made a mistake when he closed those portals. There's maybe a good point there. And like having freedom and all of that, like there were good points as Zahir made as well, and the idea that it was that they went too far and they become unbalanced in what their pursuit was, that they kind of overindulged in some regards, I thought was really effectively portrayed, and I liked what they did with I'm going to Kavira, I think was her name. I checked it on the Wikipedia page previously, and I could scroll down to it right now, but I don't feel like it. So I really liked what they did with Zelda Williams' character. I'll just go with that. And I thought that was a very compelling villain, but I also liked what they did with working through the trauma that Korra had. So, like I said, overall, I felt that it ended very strongly, and I liked what they were setting up with things. Some other things that I want to highlight that I really liked about what they did. Now, I really liked that they made like the previous cast from Avatar: The Last Airbender, because like we see, it's some number of years in the future. I really like that they made them as imperfect as they did. That like Aang and Toph were both terrible parents, and Toph like maybe had a complicated love life. They didn't make them neat, tidy little packages, but rather complicated people. And I really appreciate that they continued that philosophy. And I think that's one of the things that I really like about the work that Brian and Mike, what are their last names? DiMartino and Konietzko. That part of the Wikipedia page is convenient for me to see. And I really like their philosophy of wanting to try to make sure that you can see how the villains are the hero of their own story. You can see how they have like good points and sort of the complicatedness of things. And I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate that they try to ground things in a certain sort of realism. That they don't just want their characters to like be one note, but they want them to have complexities. That they want them to be, complicated and have strengths and weaknesses and imperfections. And that makes them a lot more true to life and a lot more relatable. And I really, really appreciate that. And that's something that I quite like. So overall, like I said, I liked Legend of Korra. And I'm looking forward to seeing what else comes from, was it Avatar Studios? Is that what they called it? And what else they create in this universe. Looking forward to seeing what the future holds. So thank you all very much for joining me. Again, if you want to support me and participate in selecting topics for future Patron podcasts of mine, you can do so at my Patreon, patreon.com/Sientir. And as always, thank you to those who are supporting me for your support. It is greatly appreciated. Until next time, everyone, take care. Goodbye.